Good morning or afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Winston Thomas, Editor-in-Chief of CDO Trends, and thanks for joining us for our leadership series, which we have been doing since last year. Today is entitled When Recovery Becomes Regulation, What Every Data Leader Needs to Know. First, our thanks to Everpure for bringing this panel together as our sponsor. And here's the question I want you sitting with us for the next hour to keep in mind. If your systems went down tonight, could you actually prove to a regulator, not just to yourselves, that what comes back online is clean, complete, and trustworthy? For a lot of organizations across Asia Pacific, the honest answer is we are not sure. That's the gap we are here to discuss and here to close. Everyone in this room is racing to scale AI. Very few have been stress tested against a simple, honest question when the disruption hits. Does the recovery actually hold up? We don't have to guess what happens when it doesn't. Japan's largest port sat idle for 2 days after a ransomware hit. A single cloud misconfiguration wiped 600,000 Australian superannuation records. And of course, we have the CrowdStrike. It all comes down to the same ending. Different causes, but at the end, it's all about recovery. Recovery becomes the story, and it's not just about the breach. And here's the shift every data leader needs to internalize. The moment an incident is contained, the clock starts. Regulators, customers, and boards are now expecting a fast, clean return to business as usual, which means resilience has quietly moved from an IT best practice to a legal obligation with your name on it. Today's conversation is actually grounded on the namesake white paper, also called When Recovery Becomes Regulation, What Every Data Leader Needs to Know. It's co-authored by Maddox and our sponsor, Everpure. So let's get straight to the people who will be live this on an everyday basis. We have Sonia Sharma, partner at Maddox. She advises corporate brands and regional regulators on privacy and incident response, as well as cross-border compliance. Interesting part that she started a career in journalism, which means it gives her a sharp instinct about the gap between what organizations say and what they actually do under pressure. We have Vaibhav Gupta, lead data architect at FedEx. Vaibhav builds and runs complex enterprise data platforms across major regional financial institutions and logistics networks. He lives the engineering trade-offs of cross-border architecture and compliance firsthand. And to round it off, we have Michael Boots, consulting field solution architect for Asia Pacific and Japan at Everpure. He sits at the intersection of engineering and governance, helping enterprises design infrastructure with resilience and regulatory recovery built in from day one. So Sonia, Vaibhav, Michael, great to have you. Let's dive in. Let's start with an interesting discussion with Sonia. Sonia, your career actually started in journalism, not law, which means you have spent years spotting the gap between a polished script and what's really happening on the ground. So the instinct matters here, especially when we have the Australia's ASICs and APRA, we have Singapore's Cybersecurity Act, we have South Korea's Critical Information Infrastructure Protection Act. It's all coming out. And they're all attaching it with real penalties and real personal liability to recovery failures. So the question to you is, when you look at real corporate incidents, how often do boards discover their recovery plans were purely aspirational once regional regulators start asking hard, auditable questions? And how are legal expectations shifting for data leaders?
Thanks, Winston. That's a great question. And I never realised how valuable my journalism degree would be, but it's been so valuable in terms of when your client ends up on the front page of the news or keeping them out. To answer your question, though, the last 2 years, we have seen such significant change. And if everyone walks away with one key lesson. I think that is the key lesson for today. The risk posture has changed so significantly. So when we look at boards and whether they're able to withstand hard attention from regulators, the answer is, at the moment, they're really struggling, and then they're not. So we've had a number of decisions in Australia where incident response plans and the way in which boards and executives responded to incidences really did fail the test. And so people might be aware of Australian Clinical Labs. That was a incident where there was a major data breach in the medical sector during an M&A transaction, and the regulator there found that the executives weren't even familiar with the incident response plan, weren't able to respond in a timely manner. And likewise, our corporate regulator has had sharp focus on the way in which executives and boards respond. But what I think is most interesting is the recovery piece. So we have moved beyond boards and executives being able to respond promptly and quickly. That is a built-in expectation. We are well beyond that. What I find really interesting, and when we look what the current expectation is that recovery piece. And just the last 2 weeks, the Australian Centre of Cybersecurity released with Five Eyes its call to action for not just those in regulated industries, but everyone, to say that not only do we need to be prepared for incidences, but we know we need to focus on fast containment and recovery in the AI era. And so for all of the executives who have wisely made the time to be here today, that's something that we need to be thinking about, not just recovering, not just responding, but how do we recover promptly? And that's where the conversation's heading.
Sonia, I just wanted to dig a bit further what you mentioned. And I think the Five Eyes, what you mentioned about the Five Eyes, we'll go into that later, but I think that's really important because it gives us a slightly different dimension to recovery. But having said that, when you are actually talking to the people, have the people changed? Because usually you will have legal, compliance, and data leaders coming together, and then you'll be talking to them in terms of recovery. But do you see data leaders now getting legal training, legal advice as part of their career, and vice versa for the legal team that needs much more data knowledge or data savviness?
Winston, it is a great question. When I look at governance and risk, one of the core issues or a red flag for me when I'm advising a client is what I call silo risk. Right. So if I see just technical teams are siloed, the legal team is siloed and just brought in to advise on issues at the end, that to me is just a red flag governance risk. Where we are moving now, and this is very clear in the regulatory direction, is that organizations need to take a whole of business approach, a 360-degree approach to risk. So what does that mean practically, to your point? It means that executives who are in a technical functional product leads need to have a base level understanding of the laws and expectations. Meanwhile, myself as a lawyer and GCs also need to have that technical understanding of how things work. And the only real way to do that is culturally, by breaking down those silos and having a whole of business approach to the way in which you approach risk. And that's a real thing. If you think about your organization operating in silos, think about breaking down that into it's more of a 360-degree approach, and also approaching things early. So security by design, privacy by design, those things become really, really relevant because they are the foundational pieces and framework pieces that ensure that you're able to recover quickly because you've thought about the issues earlier. That's the shift from silos to 360-degree approach. And the other thing that I think is really key, and the significant trend, is accountability. Who is the ultimate owner? Who who made the decisions when it came to deploying an AI agent or releasing a new functionality. Regulators are getting quite specific and granular around the accountability within an organization. So you need to be very clear on that as well.
Thanks. Strong opening, Sonia.
Yeah. So I think accountability and and breaking down silos is critical, and that's hard because it's a real cultural piece.
Yeah, and we know that's one of the most difficult part, which is the cultural piece of any organization.
Winston, can I jump in with an extra question for Sonia there? So Sonia, on that accountability side and getting in early, are you seeing organizations bring companies like Maddox in earlier into the process? So when they're developing the response documentation, are you getting consulted through the creation phase, or do you see a habit where people tend to pick up the phone to you when something's already happened? Is there a ratio of successful, happy companies versus bad companies there?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Michael. I mean, obviously, where we can get involved earlier, it's always more success. I'll take a crisis call and help at any point in time, but where you can work with your third-party providers, and that's not just lawyers, it's your whole response team. So your forensic experts, your technical teams. We want to build that resilience piece in advance. So one thing that we're doing at this moment in time is a rapid review alongside our technical stakeholders or external cyber forensic experts for a client to go, where is the client now? Where is its risk? What do we need to uplift quickly given the current landscape? What do we need to test and train in the current landscape given the AI risks? Are we building in hypotheticals or testing and training for the different types of attacks that are likely to occur now? And once you've got that resilience piece, it means you're so much more effective in being able to respond to a regulator. So a clear case study, which I can talk to because it's held up as a good example, is the DIMIX data breach, which was one of the earlier data breaches in Australia. But I helped that client draft its incident response plan, build its framework. And so when that event occurred, it was much easier for us to work together as a trusted team. So that's really critical, that building that trust piece early on, Michael, and keen to get other people's thoughts on that as well.
Thanks, Sonia. Let's shift the lens to Michael now. Michael, let's go down to the machine room where you are at the moment. What is the most uncomfortable gap you typically see between an organization's polished incident response playbook and its actual technical capacity to restore trustworthy data at scale after an outage?
Unfortunately, there's a lot of stories that show the bad side of this topic, and a lot of the times the worst stories aren't comparing what was supposed to happen with what actually happened, and it's more about showing the lack of awareness around what might happen and how we would respond. I could particularly think of one customer story. Whilst it's a public event, I won't name the company. I don't think there's any value in naming them, and I think I'm happy to have a conversation after the fact if anyone wants to. But it was a relatively small data set in the scheme of things. It was a couple of 100 terabytes, which is a lot in some people's terminology, but not enough that it would flag any big red flags to the board to say we need a special plan put in place for this type of data set. So the first problem was not really understanding not only the process, but not understanding the risk, because it didn't seem like a high risk prospect. The second one being it wasn't core to the business. It was a manufacturing organization. It wasn't the ERP. It wasn't something that was on the production network. It didn't stop a process from operating by this data not being there. What it stopped was people doing their job. So whilst the core facilities could continue to run, a lot of people couldn't do their day-to-day job without this particular data set. And in this scenario, it took several weeks for the data set to be put back. And even then, a large percent of the data was back in a relatively okay timeline, like within the first week of a relatively large percentage. But without the entire data set being recovered, you couldn't necessarily turn on production services because you didn't know what was missing. So that type of scenario, and it's been replicated several times across many different customers. I'll say the biggest gap, the most uncomfortable gaps are the gaps you don't know exist in the first place. The scenario where you have mistaken the criticality of a data set just because it wasn't a revenue generating data set, or there wasn't a legal responsibility for you to have reported, how long is it going to take for this data set to get back? And then the technology side of all, the restores had been done, tests had been done, everyone had done their job, right? No one had made a mistake here, right? No one had shirked their responsibilities. Everyone did everything they were expected. But how do you test a full data set restore of several hundred terabytes when that's a disruptive event? You would need to go out and buy a whole new array, or you would need to shut down your disaster recovery capability to test a data set restore of that size. So not understanding how long something's going to take because you're relying on 2 or 3 different technologies. And in this scenario, it was the process that broke down more than the actual technology anyway. So long story. Hopefully that's kind of touched on it. But again, that's kind of the gaps as I've seen them witnessed at certain customers.
Thanks, Michael. Vaibhav, you are the one actually running this across Asia day to day. So want to get your practical viewpoint. In the organizations you work with, who actually owns resilience-ready data architecture today? And what breaks structurally when an ownership is muddled across departments?
That's a very good question because the concept of security and resilience actually spans across multiple departments. Because it's a critical piece of your entity that we need working all the time because we are working in regulated industry. So it spans, of course, the IT security as the first your port of call, and then also covers legal, compliance, the IT departments, and other heads of as well. They're responsible and accountable for maintaining the integrity of the bank generally. Now, the pieces which really confuse the organizations, and especially if you're a multi-jurisdictional entity and working across the business segments, are your real day-to-day things like not knowing what the data sets are, not knowing the data classification, not knowing how the information is replicated and how it corrupts the overall data sets. Lineage is poorly understood as well, and that's not generally a problem which happens overnight. It's a systemic issue because the banks are a living entity, so they grow over time as well, and the legacy gets built, and the newer systems get built on top of them as well. So keeping up with the security and the moving your targets for regulatory obligations complicates the ownership, the accountability, and also there's a big difference in theory versus practice. So even when on the kit it says you're completely resilient, you can you're recover very quickly. A simple things like configuration changes can stump you. And I think we've seen enough examples, like recently, Citibank and DBS faced this issue as well. Like their recovery was quite on point, but the configuration changes really like stump the whole organization. And there are countless examples where you do everything to the T, but because you've not road tested it, that's where it doesn't really matter the accountability or responsibility, like teams are doing their job, but because it's not road tested enough, we see the problems day to day. And that's why people like us, we think not like immediate solutions that we need to solve for, but rather like a wider scenario of not just building systems which are resilient, but also making sure that they are recoverable as well within the jurisdictional guidelines of the jurisdictions we work in.
Just a quick question on that, Vaibhav. I mean, it's an interesting point in terms of you saying that when people build systems and it grows organically, and then you are also doing configuration changes, but then that sort of impacts resilience. In the organizations that you work, do you see them bringing it closer in terms of config changes and the impact on resilience? Or is that a conversation that is only now starting?
No, that's a good question. And I think Sonia and Michael can like attest to this as well. The idea of a secure bank has always been there. Nobody wants to work in an environment which is unsafe, because the operational risk and the reputation risk, which comes along the way after incidents happens, I think that is something which we all want to avoid. So everybody is aware that we need to like secure our data, the way we operate, and our interfaces across the banks as well. But the real challenging part is implementing them at scale. And implementing it comprehensively, because there are some chinks which will always occur, and that's only because a bank is a moving entity. So it's not a static being where you can just cover it and call it like this is water tested and bulletproof. That doesn't really happen. And that's a challenge as well. And with the regulatory kind of scrutiny, which is growing all the time, keeping up with the regulators also is a huge challenge, because see, the transformation of a bank takes time. It's like the time from today, let's say if I realize a gap in my security posture and recoverability posture, to the time that I implement it in a small jurisdiction as a test use case, it's like 1.5, 2 years, which has gone past already. And then underlying jurisdiction has changed and the expectation changes as well. So it's to keep up with what the regulators want. So a good case approach, which we all keep in mind, is work with the regulator, work with your legacy, train your staff, cultural shift, as Sonia was talking about as well, and making sure you build something which is not addressing immediate problem, but rather something which will stand the test of time as well.
Sonia, you were going to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think we just need to all pause and acknowledge just what a difficult and challenging time it is. Like, the pace of technology is changing so quickly. We've had a number of regulators put out urgent letters around the risks of AI. So technology is moving so quickly. We've got organisations who have legacy systems or very complex systems, constantly changing community and legal expectations. It's very challenging to keep up with everything. And so I'm curious to hear from both Michael and Barbara around how you manage that. I suppose my tips would be the frameworks need to be so strong, the culture needs to be strong, because those things are amplifiers. So what might happen is you might not have caught something, but a regulator is going to be much more forgiving if you are still able to show really strong frameworks, really strong cultures, that a privacy impact assessment or AI risk assessment was done, and that was on the roadmap to fix or road test that particular to road test something in the future. You just hadn't got to it. You are going to have a much better regulatory outcome than if you don't have those structures in place. But I was also curious on Michael's point around the categorization of data and the fact that a particular data set wasn't revenue generating, so it might have been deprioritized. I think that's quite interesting. And one thing we're seeing is, particularly with B2B businesses, employee data has often been a bit disregarded. That can be a risk as well. But I just thought I'd add those comments in as well.
Michael, your viewpoints?
Only that I think, in my advice, and the companies that I see handle this type of thing really well, and it comes back to what we've already said so far around preparation. And my personal advice is, don't aim for regulatory what's the word here? Compatibility or guidance. Don't aim for the regulatory guidance, right? Regulatory guidance is written to be achievable, and it's written for the lowest common denominator, to say we want everyone to at least be here, so we can say, rubber stamp, as a country, as a region, as a sector, as an industry, we've done our minimum requirements. Organizations that go above and beyond, and maybe this is seeking to meet the requirements of a foreign regulation, this might be trying to jump 5 years in advance. Sonia's point about the regulators will treat you more gently. So you'll be gently treated if you can show, well, we've had an issue, but you can see from our documentation, our architecture, our principles, we've been aiming for X, Y, Z over here. We didn't quite get there in this scenario, but we've shown an effort to try and get there. I think that's really important. And I think the biggest inhibitor to doing everything here is the dollar. By doing it, when you do it and you get approval, by trying to meet what are the regulations going to be in 5 years' time, right? Like, we don't know. So being able to have a flexible platform that can adapt really quickly to the changing regulations, I think, is the best use of that dollar. The challenge becomes, how do you justify the additional expense of going past the regulatory requirement today, when it's really, really hard to put a dollar value on the risk to the business for a regulation that doesn't exist currently?
Yeah.
I agree, but I think it has always been a challenge, right, Michael? Trying to justify a future event and to recover from it, but then the board will say, "Yeah, but I'd rather put the money on something that will give me revenues immediately."
Yeah.
So,
and it's been repeated for the last 30 years in IT, right? Like, once upon a time, if you go back to the 90s, it was companies self-insuring against a disaster recovery. Instead of building a disaster recovery facility, we'll self-insure against it. And guess what the conversation was the first week after they had a DR event? Let's put in a disaster recovery facility, right? It just keeps evolving.
Right.
Can I give a little tip, Winston, can I give a little tip for our executives who are trying to get more money for this issue? In Australia, the landscape has shifted so that how much revenue, people and resources you are actually investing in cybersecurity is now a consideration as to whether or not you're taking reasonable steps to protect and secure information. So this is a really good way of being able to say, to get additional revenue for the issue, because I think one of the challenges we hear is that it's difficult to get the revenue, but we have had a shift in the last year or so. It's now the law where there's sort of a defined test around whether or not an organisation is putting adequate resources, but that's both people and money, into the issue. So that can be helpful for the executives on the call to be able to take to those holding the pen on budgets.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Sonia is saying, so what I normally advise either my organization or the clients I work with is, don't look at it as a short-term race you want to win, because it won't work. The business itself, the business case itself, which you want to get sponsored, is a long-term target. So you spend the capex, and then an OPEX needs to be there in the business case itself, because generally across the board, compliance, regulatory, and fin crime are revenue. They're not, they're cost functions. They're not revenue generation for you. So the cost avoidance which you have is really the revenue which you get, which bakes into your ROI. And because the regulatory environment will keep shifting, you want to be on the good books of the regulator all the time, so that at least they can give you the grace marks as well if you need them, which shows you that you're making progress. So the business case itself needs to have that kind of buffer, which will give it continuity. It's almost like the AI efforts as well. You don't just build for the immediate build, but rather the AI production needs to happen as well. So the business case needs to have a longevity. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult.
Now I think it's a good time to have a good segue towards architecture, sovereignty, and AI trustworthiness. I think that's something that we can go deeper to the next half of the conversation. But before we move into that, I would like to tell our audience, please do ask your questions. I see questions coming in. Thank you, Manikandan. I will be posing these questions to the panelists, but do come out with your questions. We have 3 panelists who will be able to give you their take from 3 different points of view. So I think that will be an excellent time to do that. But before we move to one of those questions that's on the Q&A, I'd like to go a layer deeper into the architecture itself. Running a platform across Asia or even Australasia today means threading the needle between Australia's SOCI Act, Singapore's upcoming 2026 Digital Infrastructure Act. We have India's DPDP Act 2023 and its 2025 rules for cross-border data movement. And then you have Japan's 2025 Active Cyber Defense Law with its meaty vendor supply chain audit requirements. All this gives it a much more difficult scenario for especially an organizations who is trying to grow in the region. So first question to Sonia, and then for Michael and Vaibhav to chime in. If a major AI workload in APAC is hit by silent data corruption tomorrow, what failure modes in today's storage architectures worry you most? And this is coming from a legal expert, from your point of view, Sonia. And how does a data team empirically prove to a regulator that the recovered data set is completely clean and trustworthy?
It's such a great question, and it's complex when you're operating across a number of jurisdictions. I mean, I think what would keep me up at night is not necessarily the storage failure itself, as you've mentioned. It's what nobody realizes might have been happening to the data, particularly in the AI context. So it's like we've had the storage failure, but what's really scary in this context is nobody realizes, is this how the salient data has been corrupted. It's like we don't know, and I think that's what keeps me up at night. But I'm keen to hear from that sort of Michael and Weber from a technical perspective, because I think what's the difficulty for lawyers, and this is something that what I really encourage in this sort of breaking down of silos, is the need to have these conversations, before we roll out the AI, is that your lawyers need to be able to understand from a technical perspective what that looks like, so they're able to articulate risk for you, and we can work practically. But keen to hear from Michael and Weber as well.
Michael?
Yeah, from my perspective, I think, as Sonia kind of implied as well, right, the real risk is the risk that doesn't pop up and show itself quickly, right? So a traditional storage or infrastructure failure, it happened because stuff went away. You could have a data corruption, data manipulation, sort of soft error in an AI pipeline where no one knows there's been a corruption or a failure, right? So your LLM, where let's just say it's a law firm or something like that, you've got a language model that's providing responses and agentic workflows, could be operating and continue to operate for an unknown amount of time on corrupted, incorrect, modified. Maybe you've got like a nation state actor who's modified something inside your source data set, which has impacted the outcomes that the clients are getting. And so then the question becomes, well, how do we go back and look at what business decisions were impacted by question responses to a language model that was referring to flawed data, flawed training? And I think that's where there's a massive question mark that we're miles away from being able to answer, is how on earth do you go back and track all of that? From a data perspective, it's relatively easy. You go and say this data was manipulated at this time point, and here's a change track, and I can hash it and work out where the hash changed, right? Going back and flagging back through to what decisions were impacted by that changed data would be a really interesting one, I think. Because when the regulator knocks on the door and says, tell me every decision that was impacted by this flawed data set, and you go, well, I don't know how many people would be able to do that today.
And I think we can even stretch this a little bit further, because I think we need to be thinking into the future with these conversations. And this links into the Australian government's discussion around AI safety. I fully predict that we're going to have an incident in the future where a lot of people, unfortunately, are going to die because of an AI deployment. So if you think about like a healthcare AI agentic deployment, and the data is corrupt and it's making incorrect assumptions, and test reports are going out, there's going to be something in the future where I fully put myself on the line to say people will die as a result of an AI deployment go wrong. Like, it will be able to be traced back to that. And so I think those issues around thinking about those issues now around the provenance of the data, the integrity of it, is actually so critical, and also the accountability of who made the decisions is really important. And these discussions aren't really hypothetical in the fact that the Australian government has put out a speech which it's talked about these risks, like the immediate risks of getting regulation right, and making sure you're complying with the law, but then it calls it second horizon risks, where things have gone, the AI agent is acting in a way where it's drawing off incorrect data and having to have those. It's saying we need to have those. We need to be thinking about that now, which is quite interesting. But really keen to hear if people are thinking about those second horizon risks now.
Beth, do you guys looking at second horizon?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one caveat here is for us to realize this whole AI story is very new. Like it has just picked up the momentum in the last 3 to 4 years. It's like now the cloud conversation we had like in 2016, 2018. No transformation was possible without the cloud component being there. Similarly now, like you can't have a transformation program approved without AI component being in there. But the risk is, as poorly as AI is understood, so poorly is your governance around AI is poorly understood as well. And the inherent risk, the systemic risks that the bank actually work with, which is your poorly understood data, poor understanding of data quality, the lineage understanding, which is very weak as well, still exists. Now, when a cyber incident or an AI risk happens, the problem is you have the inherent risks, and then you compound it with the new risks which are coming in, which totally corrupts, as Michael was saying, your pipelines, your RAG indexes, your inferences, and you don't even know about them because the governance framework around protection of AI is so fragile. It's in an nascent stage as well. It's not mature. And then, as Sonia was saying, this will lead to your own decisioning. So the strategy itself, be it your growth of revenue, grab more customers, for example, or have trading infrastructure which is very secure, falls flat on the face as well. So decisioning will go wrong in multiple phases as well. So while at one extreme it could be like people's health being compromised or your life is compromised. On the other hand, it's like the business revenue and your financial losses as well. My trade's going wrong. My risk indexes are not getting like benchmarked against the right values, for example. And the risk is serious because the more and more we progress through the day, like more the desire that we all have to incorporate your AI in everything that we do, from simply your case management to your fin crime detection, to your customer risk scoring, to determining whether you can get a loan or not. Very simple things as well. You have your AI determining whether you're eligible or not, and it's all dependent on the underlying data sets. So like that's the conundrum that we all live with, like designers like us, which is sure we want to have AI in everything that we do as well, but the notion itself is not very well understood, and we all have to you're designed for something which it's almost like fending in the dark, really. So it's the reality of the situation we live through.
Points. I'd like to at this moment, I think it's a good time to actually bring up one of the questions from the audience. Thanks, Manikandan, for the question. With the aspiration to leverage AI, he asks, I'm assuming he's a he, are the firms taking the cost of non-compliance seriously? Cybersecurity budgets are only now part of the norm. How long will it take for firms to consider the investments on tools, technology, and culture building for compliance in the new AI era? Maybe, Vaibhav, you can start off from a practical point of view, because you just mentioned the challenges that you see.
Yeah, I think I'll keep this one brief. So see, the intention, which is to cover ourselves completely and make ourselves waterproof, is not new. It has always been there. And with the most of the vendors that we work with as well, like they're offering us your AI specific coverage as well, in terms of they understand our models, the data sets that we generate, runtime classification, and securing the whole AI ecosystem as well. Now, I will not say that we are thinking about AI security as an add-on now. We've always, the intention is to design systems which are completely foolproof and well protected. So, but we are paying a lot more attention to the section where we're talking about when we're designing a system around AI. There's one budget that we allocate towards the build, and then other budget that we dedicate towards the security aspects as well. And we do focus a lot on it, because not just us, but rather compliance, regulatory, legal teams as well. They're very nervous about it as well. So there's a lot more dedicated conversations happening around it, and we look at the vendors who can protect us before any AI use case gets live for us.
Michael, your thoughts?
The question's a scary one to me personally. I don't even know how to start answering it in absolute honesty, because I think we are so early in the cycle that organizations by design will spend the least amount they have to in investing to protect against this stuff that they think they can get away with. And it's not until we test that with some pretty dire situations probably that we'll actually get visibility. I'll bring a parallel back though to like a more traditional analytics kind of space. So you go back 3-4 years ago as people were trying to adopt more modern analytics platforms, one of the biggest showstoppers that held up every single project was data lineage, data governance, and data security. How do we make sure the pie chart that gets through to the quarterly report is coming from real data? We can trace it back to make sure nobody trended the data too much or no one applied too much cleansing to it so it changed the values. It was a real thing. And I haven't had a single one of those types of conversations around AI pipelines yet. I think it's still, there's always exceptions to the rule, right? Like a large Big Four bank is going to definitely be applying those kind of restrictions to an AI program. Corporates with a slightly less regulated industry, they're science experiments broadly, right, at this point. So I think we're a long way away from actually knowing how to answer the question. Me personally, like meaningfully, it's a watch this space, I think. And yeah, that's the best I can do, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Sonia, from your legal eyes?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the Australian government's position is that safety and innovation are partners. Like so we want to be deploying AI, we want to be innovating. So that's really critical. But the fact that we've had now 3 separate regulators issue letters for urgent attention, and ASIC says we're not calling for panic or reactive overreach, but we are calling for urgency, focus, and accountability when it comes to the AI risk. So it has to be on the agenda in some way that you are at least doing. I like Michael's earlier comment about reaching for more than the minimum. I really do think that is worthwhile sustainably. I think that's a really good takeaway for everyone to take away. But at least with AI, you need to be doing at least the bare minimum of showing that you've had some sort of like that risk assessment of thinking around these issues. I think that's really critical.
I think this
let's watch this space. And I do think what I know from the Australian market is when we see these letters coming out from the regulator, that is a sign that they will go after someone, right? So that happened with the third party risks. Joe Longo was on the microphone. He was in the AFR. He was saying third-party vulnerabilities are a risk. Third-party vulnerabilities are a risk. And then we saw them take the enforcement action. They're doing the same with AI. They are telling us they're telling us they're going to make a move when something goes wrong. So I think we do need to be prepared, but it's very difficult. I just want to acknowledge how difficult it is with the pace of change and the complexity that we're dealing with at the moment.
So I had this conversation with a compliance person, and he says he had another layer, which I think you alluded to at the start of this conversation, Sonia, which is like the 5 Eyes alliance. There seems to be a tug of war between geopolitical alignments like the 5 Eyes alliance and very strict localized sovereignty regimes. So I guess the question to you, and later on to Waiba, from getting it from a practitioner's point of view, in your experience, where has the tension between strict localized data sovereignty mandates and the operational need for fast cross-border data recovery been the hardest to resolve? And how do you actually handle automated failover safely? But I guess the first part is more important. It's where is it the hardest to resolve?
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Winston. It's hard operationally because each jurisdiction has different laws. There's a lot of what we call sovereignty washing going along as well with different vendors who might purport to hold data in a particular region, but if you dig down and look, that's not actually accurate. So I think we need to be conscious of that. But the starting point from the legal perspective is one, you need to know what data is being processed or handled or disclosed. Like, that's really, really key. Understanding the interactions with the various third-party vendors, and then just actually knowing where the data is going is actually the first step to any sovereignty issue. And then you can kind of work backwards from there. But Michael, I think, made the really interesting point earlier, which is I still think we have a problem where not all organisations, particularly those that are lower down the maturity scale, have that visibility of where their data is, who's got access to it, what third-party processes are being used, and actually that's really key to getting that right before you can deal with sovereignty shock or sovereignty risk. But one thing I think to be cautious of is be prepared to ask sort of difficult questions and do that technical due diligence, because there is a lot of what we call sovereignty washing, where a vendor might purport to hold data in a particular region, and that's not accurate when you ask harder questions. But I'm really keen to get the technical input on these questions as well.
Yeah, sure. I think this is very critical for us, because specifically when you work for a bank like, let's say, HSBC, Deutsche, JP Morgan, which is multi-jurisdictional, and I think I touched upon this point earlier, that Asia is very challenging because of the inconsistencies and differences in the regulatory kind of your asks as well. So banks have very difficult your arrangement or technical decision to make, which is, can we deploy a global your security or recovery system, or do we have to bake in regional nuances as well? And the answer is the latter, which is you can't have one global policy which is one size fits all approach, because then you will be the bad side of your one jurisdiction or the other. We can't afford that as well. So the way we think about your aligning with the regulatory obligation is we build a centralized skeleton control framework, as we call it as well. And then we work with the legal and compliance team to understand the regional nuances, and we try to bake them in incrementally. So you don't start with oh, Indonesia wants that, India wants that, Australia wants that, Hong Kong wants that, because it's a rabbit hole. You will never be achieving the target state, but rather build a bare minimum but really comprehensive control structure, where you understand your data, its lineage, the AI readiness, compatibility, and the bare minimum your requirements which the regulators are asking us to do, and then incrementally year on year work with the regulator and make your control framework very, very strong. What we focus on is to make sure that the business objectives that we have around the business services, the recovery objectives, the regulatory obligations, they are delivered all the time, and they're auditable as well, because I think Sonia might agree that the dial have shifted now. It's not just about making sure I show the paper I'm good and I'm gold standard. You have to show that your policies and frameworks are working in action. So if your recovery time is literally minutes, it has to be minutes. It can't be hours and days, because that will really make the regulator very upset with your efforts as well. So you should follow what your words are saying as well. That's very critical for us as practitioners.
It's such good advice. Such two key takeaways there are regional regulators will be looking for a region, you have to be able to respond regionally. And the amount of times the IIC or the Australian regulators gotten upset because the framework did not respond specifically to the Australian regime. So Uber is the leading decision on that. It's key. So having that baseline framework able to flex. But then Viber's other critical point, that's the other shift that we've seen in the last 2 years, is that the regulator, they will investigate an issue, they'll interrogate it, they'll look for the logs, evidence, auditability, traceability. It all needs to be able to stand up, and they're looking well beyond the policies, procedures and paper to the actual technical and organisational measures, and if they were in fact implemented, and that's the shift.
Thanks. Michael, from your perspective, especially from a solution engineering or product engineering perspective, I'm just wondering, for Everpure's automated classification capabilities, how not looking at the actual capabilities or the features, but I'm looking at how, as a vendor or solution provider, the way you approach the market and the way you address clients' needs in this time and age has sort of shifted the way you do product engineering and solution engineering.
Yeah, I think, and I want to just like call out how people use the same definition differently to a degree as well, because I think a lot of decision makers go, "Where's my data?" But a lot of IT practitioners are going, "Where does my service exist?" So if it's let's just say if it's a bank, the bank's going, "I know where my core processing app lives. It's got this front end, it's got this database, and it lives here." And that, the 3-tiered application stack lives here and it exists here. The decision maker, so that let's just say the board member or the director who makes the has the final accountability, is thinking, where does my data live? But the IT department are building architectures around services and service stacks. The two don't necessarily meet, right? Because yes, the person's bank account information is within that database. But if we're talking about data, what we need to be asking is, where is every instance of that person's account number or unique identifier, or insert whatever piece of data that's relevant here, anything PII, let's just say. Where does every instance of that data live within the business? And that might be an on-premise production data center. That might be a backup tape from 10 years ago sitting in Iron Mountain collecting dust that we don't even know if someone could read data off of or not. And I think that's what we as Everpure are looking to help customers with moving forward now, is being able to say, look, yes, we know it's sitting in the core database. That's a no-brainer. We know their data's there. Here's a Word document sitting in a file share that's accessible by HR, by core business apps, and by the IT department, that has 6 references to a text string that looks like that person's bank account number. And I think that's the challenge that we're going to be facing, especially as we start using training data sets or augmenting inference response with live data sets, is being able to show, is there any sensitive data that accidentally found its way into an inferencing data set, those types of things. Because I think that's what we as a company are looking to help customers with moving forward.
And there is also the dark data audits that you have to do to make sure you understand what kind of data that you have, right, Michael?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. We are reaching the end of our discussion. So do come in with your questions. I'm going to look at this last question, and I will point it to what Sandesh has asked over the Q&A, because it sort of resonates with what I wanted to end our discussion on. If recovery becomes a regulatory requirement, he asks, and a regulator walks in daintily into your organizations tomorrow and asks you to prove how you can recover from a major cyber attack, what evidence would you present, and and this is the part which I really like to ask all three of you all, is the one measure that truly differentiates organizations that are resilient from those that are merely compliant? So Sonia, maybe you can start on this on a more of a legal perspective. Then I'll go to the technical perspective with Michael and Vaibhav.
Sure. I mean, I think from an Australian perspective, but also across Asia Pacific, they'll be looking at both the technical and organisational measures. So there's no point having the technical. You need to have both. So that is the biggest shift. And what's interesting, I think, about Australia as well, is that actually looking at the culture within an organisation and that training and governance piece, that's also critically important. But the granularity of what they're looking for, going back to what Michael was sharing, is that the auditability, traceability, all of those things are critically important. So it's both. They're looking at both the technical and organisational measures, and they're looking for proportionality when it comes to level of investment. That's the other critical piece of evidence that we're seeing regulators look for.
Michael, from your perspective, what keeps an organization that is resilient from an organization that is just doing compliance or checking compliance?
The obvious one is testing the workflow. From what do you need to hand over, it's going to be a run sheet of, this is our disaster response plan or our incident response plan. Here's tick boxes of the people that conducted it. And I would say the differentiation and the thing I would recommend, money's no object, obviously. Everyone's got unlimited amounts of money to throw at this, definitely. Hint, wink, wink. Full testing versus partial testing. I think the people that get into trouble run a partial test. They do a 1%, 10%, because pragmatically speaking, that's all they have the budget, the technical capability, and the time to do. It's really hard, like to do a full recovery test. But every scenario where we've seen, I shouldn't say every, lots of scenarios where people have gotten stung, they did a partial restore. Let's just say the first 5% of your data was really easy to store. It was massive, big, flat files, and it all restored really, really fast. And then you got past the first 5% and you turned into 400 billion 1K files, and it took 5 weeks to restore, and you didn't know it was going to take 5 weeks. So the more testing you do against more of your entire service data set, the more reliable your response will be.
Vaibhav?
Just like what I said earlier, like any bank or institution which can walk the talk is a differentiator. So it's not like what you say you have done it, or it's not just about describing what resilience is. It's rather to prove that you are resilient and you can recover your business operations. Now, the way I think about this scenario is the winning institution will be able to show that they are able to recover from an incident to the regulator, empirically. And they can validate the data integrity, the lineage, and also your AI workload, that it's working as expected against the baseline. The real problem happens when your objectives are very different from the ground reality. And we have seen countless examples, right? Like your 2023, the Capita, your incidents happened as well. 6.5 million customer data was stolen, and then against their baseline that they'll be able to recover this in 1 hour, it took them 58 hours. So which will upset the regulator much more than you admitting upfront that our practices are work in order or work in progress, and we're not quite there. So it's demonstration of your policies is what matters and differentiates the winner from people who are still not up to the game yet.
Thanks. We have covered a lot of ground, but we are running out of time. It seems like this is a discussion we can have for the next 2 hours. But we are limited by time. So let's end with a crystal ball round of 60 seconds each, just to hear your key takeaways and summaries from what you have heard. Maybe we can start with you, Sonia.
I might end where I started, which is to say, I found this conversation so valuable. And if it highlights one thing, it is how important it is to break down silos. So to be having this conversation with Vaibhav and Michael is just so valuable. So if you can do one thing within your organization, I would encourage you to be proactive, thinking ahead, and working towards breaking down those cycles, because you will achieve so much when you're able to do that. And I think thinking critically of those risks which we can't quite crystallize yet, but if you can be thinking intentionally about those with the support of Everpure and those other third-party providers, you'll be well placed. It's important to be thinking ahead.
Vaibhav?
Yeah, thank you. So I think I do like what Sonia was saying earlier, which is make compliance and legal team part of your journey, because they can advise you from third-party perspective of the risks we are probably blindsided to. And I also like Michael's assertion, which is it's not just good enough to do 5%, 10% of the testing, because that is exactly where the failover points are. The scalability is what breaks the camel's back. So 3 things which I always keep in mind is the scale matters, the size matters, because that will really fail you. And then just make sure you understand that your problem that you're solving is not an immediate problem to be solved for. Have the business case, which is water tested, plan for the future as well, and make sure it's well funded. That is what's going to keep you in good stead. And work with a regulator. They're not your enemies, rather they'll help you in the journey as well. So the more you align the regulators well, the better your preposition is.
Thanks. And Michael?
I love Vaibhav's point about scale matters. So I would argue when you're making decisions, it's not appropriate to say, are we compliant? Can we restore? everyone can restore. Like, that's not hard. Can we restore in a meaningful time frame with reliable, trusted data set? And that requires the response mechanism to be less hops away from the production service. So you need a cyber resilient solution where your production services have the cyber resilience baked in for instantaneous recovery, rather than relying on tape media, remote media, data coming from a different region. It has to be there and it has to be present. And we have to shift our thinking away from recovering service level awareness to detailed, granular data awareness. So we need to know where is all the PII data? Is it just in the database, or is it sitting in some file shares and some Word documents and things like that? So that would be my advice. And that's what our conversations with customers are trending towards these days. Thank you, Michael. We have come to the end, but if you have noticed that I've been referring to a lot of the conclusions coming from this white paper that I mentioned earlier, the namesake white paper co-authored by Maddox and Everpure. You can get to it. You can get to the link. What you need to do is fill up the feedback form. Yes, we really want your feedback. We are not kidding about that. So please let us know how we did, how we can do better. But more importantly, you will get a link. As you see the QR code on screen, scan it and you can fill it up and we will send you the link. At this moment, I will say a big thank you to Everpure for making this roundtable possible. And more importantly, Sonia, Vaibarv, and Michael for taking their time off and being part of this candid frontline insights that they have shared. And to all of you for spending this hour, slightly more than an hour, with us. So here's from CDO Trends and Winston, thank you. And we wish you a great afternoon.